In 1850, a plantation owner in rural Mississippi acquired a pregnant enslaved woman at auction. Standard procedure would have been to record her arrival, and nothing more. But when the child was born 6 weeks later, a clerk made an unusual notation in the birth registry, one that would remain buried in courthouse archives for over 170 years. The name listed as previous owner didn't match the auction records. It matched the current master's business partner, a wealthy judge who had publicly denied ever owning slaves. This single documentary inconsistency would eventually expose an interstate breeding network, falsified records, and a conspiracy of silence that reached the highest levels of local government. The truth emerged not through justice, but through the persistence of genealogists in 2019 who found the records by accident while researching something entirely unrelated. This is the story of how one birth certificate became evidence of a crime that destroyed generations, and how the descendants of both enslaved and enslavers grapple with a truth too long buried. 70 miles south of Memphis, in a Mississippi county where cotton fields stretched beyond sight, October 1850 brought unseasonably cold winds. The courthouse auction block saw its usual traffic that month: livestock, equipment, land deeds, and human beings. On October 14th, plantation owner Richard Whitmore purchased an enslaved woman identified in auction documents only as Sarah, approximately 22 years old, visibly pregnant, healthy condition. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The transaction itself appeared routine. Whitmore paid $850, a premium price that reflected both Sarah's youth and her condition. Pregnant enslaved women represented future labor and future property. The economics were cold and calculated. What made this purchase extraordinary wouldn't become apparent for 6 weeks, and wouldn't become understood for 169 years. Sarah arrived at Whitmore's Oakmont plantation on October 16th. The overseer's ledger recorded her arrival with characteristic brevity: new acquisition, quarters assigned, field work suspended pending birth, no surname, no previous location, no family connections documented. This erasure of identity was standard practice. Enslaved people were treated as livestock, their histories deliberately severed. The plantation itself was unremarkable by the standards of the antebellum South. Oakmont comprised 1,200 acres, primarily cotton production, with tobacco as a secondary crop. Whitmore owned approximately 43 enslaved people according to the 1850 census. Though such records were notoriously incomplete and manipulated, he maintained a reputation as a respectable planter, meaning he attended church, served on civic committees, and kept his most brutal practices hidden from public view. Sarah was assigned to a cabin in the quarters, sharing space with 3 other women. The work suspension was temporary. Pregnant women typically labored until the final weeks and returned to the fields within weeks of giving birth. Children born into slavery belonged to the master from their first breath. They were property, not family. This was the legal and social reality that governed every aspect of their existence. November arrived with early frost. On the morning of November 28th, Sarah went into labor. The plantation's midwife, an older enslaved woman named Ruth who had delivered dozens of babies over 2 decades, attended the birth. A son was born shortly after dawn. He was healthy, crying vigorously, showing no signs of complications. Ruth wrapped him and handed him to his mother. What happened next diverged from routine. Whitmore insisted on formal documentation, unusual for enslaved births which were often recorded only in plantation ledgers if at all. He summoned the county clerk to Oakmont that same afternoon. The clerk, a man named Henderson who supplemented his government salary by handling private documentation for local planters, arrived with his record books. The birth certificate was prepared on official county paper. Child's name, Thomas. Mother's name, Sarah. Owner, Richard Whitmore. But then Henderson added a line that wasn't standard: previous ownership documented per maternal records. And under that line he wrote a name: Judge Marcus Thornhill. The document was filed, sealed, and forgotten. The birth was recorded in Whitmore's plantation ledger simply as boy born to Sarah. No mention of Thornhill. No explanation for the clerk's notation. The paper trail diverged, one document suggesting something the other concealed. Thomas grew up in the quarters, separated from his mother by the time he could walk. By age 7, he was working the tobacco fields. By age 12, he was in the cotton fields during harvest. His childhood was measured in labor, In hunger, carefully calibrated to maintain productivity without excess cost. In punishments designed to enforce absolute submission. Sarah lived another 9 years at Oakmont. She bore 2 more children, both girls, both immediately separated and sold to distant plantations before their second birthdays. She died in 1859, cause listed in plantation records as fever. She was approximately 31 years old. She was buried in the unmarked section of ground beyond the fields where enslaved people were interred without ceremony or stone. Thomas survived the Civil War, Emancipation, and Reconstruction. He took the surname Freeman, a common choice among newly freed people. He worked as a sharecropper on the same land where he'd been enslaved, trapped in an economic system that differed from slavery mostly in name. He never learned to read. He never saw his birth certificate. He never knew the name Marcus Thornhill meant anything. The document remained in courthouse archives, filed among thousands of similar records that documented the systematic dehumanization of an entire people. Marcus Thornhill occupied a different world than the people he owned, though he publicly insisted he owned none. In 1850, Judge Thornhill served on the county circuit court, presiding over property disputes, criminal cases, and the legal machinery that sustained slavery. He owned a 3-story mansion in town, maintained a law practice, and cultivated a reputation as a progressive voice who privately expressed discomfort with the peculiar institution while publicly defending it as legal and necessary. His denials of slave ownership weren't casual evasions, they were documented, repeated, and strategic. In an 1848 letter to a Northern abolitionist newspaper that had criticized Southern judges, Thornhill wrote, "While I defend the constitutional rights of property owners in this region, I maintain no such property myself. My wealth derives from legal practice, land speculation, and commercial investments. I neither buy nor sell human beings." The letter was published and widely circulated. It established Thornhill's public identity as someone who navigated the moral complexities of slavery with supposed integrity, profiting from the system while keeping his own hands ostensibly clean. Church records show he donated generously. Town records show he funded a school for white children. His judicial decisions were considered fair within the racist framework of antebellum justice, but census records told a different story. The 1840 census listed Thornhill as owning 4 enslaved people. The 1850 census listed none. The 1860 census again, none. This wasn't unusual. Wealthy slaveholders often manipulated census data to avoid taxation or public scrutiny. What was unusual was the pattern of pregnant women appearing and disappearing from plantation records throughout the region, with Thornhill's name appearing in marginal notations that made no sense to casual observers. Whitmore and Thornhill maintained a business relationship that appeared legitimate on the surface. They co-owned a cotton gin. They jointly invested in railroad expansion projects. They attended the same church, served on overlapping civic committees, and socialized at the same gatherings. Nothing about their association suggested anything beyond normal commercial partnership among men of their class. Sarah's presence complicated this narrative, but only if someone looked closely enough to notice the discrepancy, and for 169 years no one did. Thornhill's legal career included several cases that, in retrospect, revealed his deeper involvement in the systems he claimed to avoid. In 1851, he presided over a case involving an enslaved man accused of attempting escape. The punishment was brutal, public whipping followed by sale to the Deep South, essentially a death sentence given the mortality rates on sugar and rice plantations. Thornhill's ruling emphasized the necessity of maintaining order and deterring similar offenses. In 1853, he adjudicated a dispute between 2 planters over ownership of an enslaved woman and her children. The case hinged on whether children followed the mother's status or could be claimed by multiple parties if parentage was disputed. Thornhill ruled that children belonged to whoever owned the mother at the time of birth, regardless of paternity. This ruling had obvious implications for breeding programs and forced reproduction. The financial records that survived show Thornhill's wealth increased substantially during the 1840s and 1850s. Despite his claims of avoiding slave-based profits, land holdings expanded, investments diversified. By 1860, he was among the wealthiest men in the county, though his assets remained largely documented as commercial and speculative ventures. His mansion still stands, now operated as a bed and breakfast. A historical marker outside mentions his judicial service and civic contributions. It makes no mention of Sarah or Thomas or the network that birth certificates suggested. Thornhill died in 1872, 7 years after the Confederacy's collapse. His obituary praised him as a pillar of the community who had navigated difficult times with wisdom and restraint. His estate was divided among 3 white children and several grandchildren. Legal records show no acknowledgement of any other offspring, though genetic testing conducted in 2021 would reveal a different truth. The system that allowed men like Thornhill to profit from slavery while denying involvement wasn't an aberration. It was the design, plausible deniability built into every transaction. Records kept, but strategically incomplete. Names documented, but connections obscured. The paper trail existed, but only for those who knew how to read between the lines. And for 169 years, no one read closely enough. The relationship between Whitmore and Thornhill represented something more systematic than a single transaction involving Sarah and her unborn child. Courthouse records, when examined collectively rather than individually, revealed a pattern that operated across county lines and state boundaries, a pattern that would only become visible with computer analysis in the 21st century. Between 1840 and 1860, at least 17 pregnant enslaved women passed through transactions involving either Whitmore or Thornhill, though their names rarely appeared together in the same documents. The women would be purchased at auction by various intermediaries, spend several months at plantations with documented ties to one or both men, and then either remain at those locations or be sold again after giving birth. The children, without exception, remained with the final purchaser. This wasn't random market fluctuation. The prices paid were consistently above market rates for pregnant women, suggesting buyers knew they were acquiring more than just one person's labor. The timing was precise. Acquisitions timed to births, births timed to sales, sales structured to obscure the chain of ownership. Someone was coordinating these transactions with business-like efficiency. Modern historians call it a breeding network, though such language rarely appeared in historical documents. Instead, records used euphemisms, encouraging natural increase, promoting demographic expansion, securing future labor forces. The practice was widespread throughout the South, though documenting specific networks remains difficult because participants intentionally obscured their involvement. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Sarah's case suggested Thornhill operated as a supplier, acquiring or fathering children through enslaved women he controlled, then transferring those women to business partners before birth to avoid direct documentation. The birth certificate clerk's notation, previous ownership documented per maternal records, may have been an administrative error, or perhaps a small act of documentation by someone who understood what was happening but lacked power to stop it. Financial records support this interpretation. Thornhill's commercial accounts show regular payments described as consultation fees and partnership distributions from various planters, including Whitmore. These payments weren't tied to any specific legal services or documented business ventures. They followed a pattern. Payments made shortly after births at associated plantations, amounts varying but consistently substantial. The network extended beyond Mississippi. Auction records in Memphis, Natchez, and New Orleans show similar patterns involving some of the same intermediary buyers and sellers. Women purchased in one state, transported across state lines while pregnant, delivered children in another jurisdiction, then sold again. This interstate movement made tracking nearly impossible without modern database analysis. Church records add another disturbing dimension. Several ministers who served congregations attended by network participants later wrote private letters expressing concern about unchristian practices among their wealthiest parishioners. One 1855 letter, discovered in a Virginia archive in 2018, specifically mentioned Judge T of Mississippi, who speaks against bondage while profiting most foully from its worst aspects. The letter was never sent, perhaps from fear of social or economic repercussions. The system required cooperation at multiple levels. Auctioneers who asked no questions about why certain buyers consistently sought pregnant women, clerks who recorded births without investigating discrepancies in ownership history, sheriffs who enforced property laws without examining how that property was acquired, lawyers who drew up sale documents designed to obscure rather than clarify, communities that maintained deliberate ignorance about where wealth actually came from. This wasn't hidden because it was illegal. Forced reproduction of enslaved people was explicitly legal under antebellum law. It was hidden because even in a society that accepted slavery, some practices were too brutal to acknowledge openly. Profit and respectability required moral distance, plausible deniability, the ability to claim ignorance of details while benefiting from outcomes. Thomas grew up surrounded by other children in similar circumstances. The Oakmont quarters housed at least 12 children under age 10 in 1855, an unusually high proportion for a plantation of that size. Several bore physical resemblances to Whitmore or visiting white men. No one acknowledged these resemblances. The children were property, their parentage legally irrelevant. The network continued operating through the Civil War years, adapting to changing circumstances. As Union forces approached and enslaved people fled to freedom, documentation became even more obscured. Plantation ledgers were burned. Court records were lost in various fires and raids. Men like Whitmore and Thornhill prepared for a future where their wartime activities might be scrutinized. Thornhill died, leaving a carefully constructed legacy of judicial service and civic responsibility. Whitmore survived until 1879, dying quietly at age 72. Their obituaries mentioned business success and community leadership. Neither mentioned the 17 documented women, or the children those women bore, or the system that treated human reproduction as commercial agriculture. The records remained, scattered across multiple jurisdictions, filed in archives that no one thought to cross-reference for another 140 years. June 1865 brought the news to Oakmont Plantation 3 weeks after official surrender. A Union officer arrived with papers declaring all enslaved people in Mississippi legally free. Thomas was 15 years old, still working the same tobacco fields where he'd labored since childhood. The officer read the proclamation. Whitmore stood silent. The words free and freedom meant nothing yet. Freedom without land, without money, without education, without any means of survival. Most of the formerly enslaved people at Oakmont stayed, not because they chose slavery, but because the alternatives were starvation or violence from white vigilante groups that roamed the countryside attacking black people who tried to leave plantations. Sharecropping replaced slavery in name, but the economic reality remained nearly identical. Perpetual debt, company stores with inflated prices, contracts that couldn't be broken without risking arrest. Thomas became a sharecropper on Oakmont land. He married a woman named Clara who had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. They had 6 children. 3 survived to adulthood. The sharecropping contracts kept them in permanent poverty, always owing more than they could earn, trapped in a cycle identical to slavery except for the word used to describe it. The birth certificate remained in courthouse archives, but accessing such records required literacy, money for filing fees, and the assumption that documents might reveal something worth knowing. Thomas couldn't read. He had no money. And he had no reason to believe that a piece of paper from his birth might explain the circumstances that shaped his entire existence. This was the silence that followed emancipation, not the silence of forgetting, but the deliberate silence of systems that continued operating under new names. The same people who owned plantations before the war owned them after. The same judges who enforced slave codes enforced black codes and Jim Crow laws. The same social structures that maintained white supremacy during slavery maintained it through Reconstruction and beyond. Whitmore never faced consequences for his involvement in the breeding network. Neither did Thornhill's descendants, who inherited his wealth and social position. The fortune built on forced reproduction and family destruction funded their education, their businesses, their comfortable lives. They told themselves stories about hard work and wise investments. They didn't mention where the capital came from. Legal challenges to recover land or wages from former enslavers went nowhere. Courts that had enforced slavery now enforced contracts designed to replicate slavery's economic effects. Judges who had ruled on property disputes involving human beings now ruled on sharecropping disputes that kept formerly enslaved people landless and exploited. Justice was a word that applied to white people. Black people received law enforcement designed to control and extract. Thomas tried to vote in 1867 during the brief window when federal troops enforced Reconstruction. White vigilantes burned his cabin 2 weeks later. He rebuilt. They burned it again. He stopped trying to vote. This was the choice offered. Accept subjugation or face violence. Most chose survival over resistance, not from cowardice, but from brutal calculation of impossible odds. The children born from the breeding network grew up scattered across the South, most never knowing their true origins. They carried their mother's trauma in stories told quietly, in warnings about white men, in silences that spoke louder than words. But the specific details, names, dates, documentation, remained locked in archives that might as well have been on another planet. Clara died in 1889, age 43, cause listed as consumption, tuberculosis, a disease of poverty and malnutrition. Thomas remarried a younger woman named Ruth. They had 2 more children. He worked until his body gave out, then died in 1914 at age 64, buried in a segregated cemetery without a headstone. His children and grandchildren migrated north during the Great Migration, seeking escape from the violence and poverty of the Jim Crow South. They settled in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, cities where racism was different but not absent, where economic opportunities were real but limited, where they could vote but faced housing discrimination and employment barriers. They carried stories passed down through generations, stories about slavery, about Oakmont, about a judge named Thornhill, whose name appeared in family oral history, but whose connection remained unexplained. Younger generations heard these stories and struggled to understand. Slavery seemed distant, historical, something that happened to other people long ago. The living consequences, poverty, trauma, fractured family connections, were present, but their origins felt abstract. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, courthouse records deteriorated slowly. Water damage, mold, neglect. No one prioritized preserving documents about enslaved people. That history was actively suppressed by white communities that preferred mythology about the Old South to confronting actual history. Archives focused on preserving records about white families, white property ownership, white civic life. The birth certificate survived by accident, filed among thousands of similar documents that documented the systematic dehumanization of hundreds of thousands of people. It survived because no one looked at it. It survived because its significance wasn't understood. It survived because the silence that followed emancipation was so complete that even evidence of crimes remained invisible. That silence would last another century. By the 1960s, Thomas's grandchildren and great-grandchildren had built lives far from Mississippi. They owned homes, earned degrees, raised families in northern and western cities where segregation was less total and violence less overt. But distance didn't erase the questions that lived in family stories. James Freeman, Thomas's great-grandson, grew up in Detroit hearing his grandmother speak about Mississippi, about a plantation called Oakmont, about a judge whose name carried weight in family memory, though no one could explain why. Born in 1945, James came of age during the Civil Rights Movement, when questions about history and justice and reparations moved from private family conversations to public demand. In 1968, while studying history at Wayne State University, James began researching his family background. This was unusual at the time. Genealogical research for black families hit walls quickly, blocked by slavery's deliberate erasure of records. Birth certificates rarely existed for enslaved people. Marriage records didn't apply to people who couldn't legally marry. Property records listed people as property, not people. James traveled to Mississippi during summer break in 1969. He visited the county courthouse, now air-conditioned and modernized but still occupying the same building where Sarah's sale and Thomas's birth had been recorded. He asked to see birth records from the 1850s. The clerk, a white woman in her 50s, looked at him with barely concealed hostility. "Those records are disorganized," she said. "Would take weeks to find anything specific. Besides, most colored births weren't officially recorded." Translation: "I'm not helping you and there's nothing you can do about it." James left Mississippi without answers. He wrote letters to archives, historical societies, genealogical organizations. Responses were polite but unhelpful. Slavery records existed, but accessing them required knowing exactly what to look for, where to look, and having resources to travel and pay research fees. For most black families, this was impossible. The civil rights movement achieved legal victories but couldn't recover lost history. Integration of schools and public spaces didn't integrate archives or make historical records more accessible. The silence that began during slavery, reinforced during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, continued through the 1970s and 1980s, not from active suppression, but from passive neglect. James's daughter, Patricia Freeman Johnson, inherited his questions when he died in 1994. She grew up hearing about Oakmont, about Judge Thornhill, about mysteries that couldn't be solved because records supposedly didn't exist. By the 2000s, Genealogical research had been transformed by digitization and online databases. What was impossible in 1969 was merely difficult in 2009. Patricia joined Ancestry.com and other genealogical platforms. She built a family tree backward from what she knew: names, dates, locations, hitting the inevitable wall at Thomas Freeman, born enslaved in 1850, mother Sarah, father unknown, owner Richard Whitmore. Beyond that, nothing. Sarah had no surname in records, no birth date, no origin location. She existed in documentation only as property. But Patricia kept searching. She joined online groups focused on African American genealogy. She learned about plantation records, county archives, and the complex paper trails that slavery generated. She learned that while enslaved people were dehumanized, they were also expensive property, which meant detailed records sometimes existed for financial rather than humane reasons. In 2015, she took a DNA test through Ancestry DNA. The results showed expected African ancestry, but also matches with people whose family trees suggested connections to Mississippi planter families. This was common. Rape and forced reproduction left genetic traces across racial lines, evidence of crimes that no one acknowledged. One DNA match was particularly strong: a third cousin connection to someone with the surname Thornhill, descended from Judge Marcus Thornhill's documented white children. Patricia reached out. The initial response was defensive. My family didn't own slaves. Judge Thornhill was opposed to slavery. Patricia sent the historical record: Thornhill's documented slave ownership in 1840, his judicial ruling supporting slavery, his business connections to known slaveholders. The DNA match stopped responding. Some truths were too uncomfortable to acknowledge, even with genetic evidence. But the connection intrigued Patricia. Why would her family carry oral memory of Thornhill's name if there was no connection? Why would DNA show a familial relationship? She began researching Thornhill specifically, looking for any records that might explain the link. She found his published letters denying slave ownership. She found his obituary praising his character. She found property records and court cases, but she found no direct connection to Thomas or Sarah. The documentary trail was too fragmented, too deliberately obscured. In 2018, she decided to visit Mississippi herself. She was 63 years old, retired from a career as a school teacher, financially stable enough to take time for this research. She drove from Detroit to the county where Oakmont once stood. The plantation buildings were long gone, replaced by modern agriculture and scattered housing developments, but the courthouse remained. This time, the clerk was younger, less hostile. Attitudes had shifted, though incompletely. Patricia explained she was researching her great-great-grandfather, born enslaved in 1850. The clerk seemed genuinely interested to help, but doubtful records existed. Birth certificates for enslaved people are extremely rare, the clerk said. Most births were only recorded in plantation ledgers, and most of those were lost or destroyed. Patricia asked anyway. Could she look at 1850 birth records? The clerk brought out massive ledger books, pages yellowed and fragile. These are all births recorded that year. But again, most enslaved births weren't officially filed. Patricia began reading through entries. She almost missed it. There, on a page dated November 28, 1850, a brief entry: child's name, Thomas mother's name, Sarah owner, Richard Whitmore. Previous ownership documented per maternal records, Judge Marcus Thornhill. Patricia stared at those words. Previous ownership documented per maternal records, Judge Marcus Thornhill. There it was, the connection her family had carried in oral memory for 168 years, written in faded ink by a clerk who probably had no idea what he was documenting. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Sarah and Thomas's story reach more people. The birth certificate photocopy cost $3. Patricia held it carefully as she walked out of the courthouse into Mississippi sunshine. She sat in her rental car for 20 minutes reading and rereading those lines. Previous ownership documented per maternal records, Judge Marcus Thornhill. This wasn't just confirmation of family memory. It was evidence of something systematic. Why would a birth certificate reference previous ownership unless there was something unusual about the transaction? Why would Thornhill's name appear if he supposedly didn't own enslaved people? What did maternal records mean? Patricia spent the next week in Mississippi archives. She found property records showing Thornhill owned 4 enslaved people in 1840 but none in 1850 or 1860. She found his business partnership documents with Whitmore. She found auction records from October 1850 showing Sarah's purchase by Whitmore, but no documentation of who sold her. The trail was deliberately obscured, but the birth certificate was the thread that could unravel it. Patricia contacted genealogists who specialized in slavery research. She contacted historians who studied antebellum economic systems. She contacted journalists who covered racial justice issues. Most were interested but cautious. Proving a systematic breeding network from fragmentary records 170 years old was extraordinarily difficult. But Patricia had something previous researchers didn't: DNA evidence showing a genetic connection between her family and Thornhill's descendants, combined with documentary evidence placing Thornhill's name on her great-great-grandfather's birth certificate. This wasn't speculation. This was proof that required explanation. In 2019, Patricia partnered with Dr. Elena Martinez, a historian at the University of Mississippi who specialized in slavery and forced reproduction. Together, they began systematic research into Whitmore's and Thornhill's business dealings, cross-referencing property records, court documents, and census data. What emerged was damning. At least 17 pregnant enslaved women had been purchased by Whitmore or his business associates between 1840 and 1860. All gave birth within weeks or months of purchase. All the births occurred at plantations with documented financial connections to Judge Thornhill. The children remained enslaved at their birth locations. The women were sometimes sold again, sometimes kept, but never reunited with children taken from them. Financial records showed regular payments from these plantation owners to Thornhill, described as legal consultation fees, despite no corresponding legal work documented. The amounts correlated with births: larger payments following multiple births, smaller payments following single births, no payments during periods with no births. This was a business: systematic, organized, profitable, and completely legal under antebellum law, which made it even more horrifying. Nothing about this violated the law because enslaved people had no legal protections against any form of exploitation. Dr. Martinez submitted findings to academic journals. The research went through peer review, with historians examining every documented claim. In November 2020, the Journal of Southern History published their article, Forced Reproduction Networks in Antebellum, Mississippi, the Thornhill-Whitmore Case Study. The publication sparked immediate controversy. Thornhill's descendants objected to their ancestor being slandered with unproven accusations. They hired lawyers to demand retractions. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, the DNA matches coincidental, the financial records explainable through legitimate business dealings. But the documentary evidence was clear. The birth certificate alone proved Thornhill had owned Sarah before Whitmore purchased her while pregnant. The pattern of transactions proved systematic coordination. The DNA evidence proved biological relationships that explained why the Freeman family carried Thornhill's name in oral memory. White descendants of slaveholders face an uncomfortable choice when confronted with this evidence: acknowledge ancestral crimes and grapple with how inherited wealth derives from exploitation, or deny evidence and preserve comfortable family mythologies. Most choose denial. It's psychologically easier to dismiss documentation than to accept that family fortune originated in systematic rape and family destruction. Patricia gave interviews to regional newspapers, then national media. NPR covered the story. The New York Times published a feature article. CNN produced a documentary segment. The story resonated because it illustrated how thoroughly slavery's crimes had been obscured, and how DNA testing and digitized records were finally making it possible to reconstruct what had been deliberately hidden. Oakmont Plantation's former location became a site of interest for historians and descendants. The land was now owned by an agricultural corporation that had no connection to the original owners. Patricia organized a memorial gathering in October 2021, 171 years after Sarah's purchase. About 50 people attended, mostly descendants of formerly enslaved people from various plantations in the area. They placed a marker where the plantation quarters had once stood. It read, "In memory of Sarah, Thomas, and the 17 documented women whose lives and children were commodified by the Thornhill-Whitmore breeding network, 1840-1865. Their names and stories were deliberately erased but are not forgotten." Thornhill's descendants did not attend. They issued a statement through their lawyer calling the memorial historically irresponsible and hurtful to the Thornhill family legacy. They did not address the documentary evidence. They did not acknowledge genetic evidence. They defended memory against history, mythology against facts. This is the pattern that repeats across the South and beyond. When confronted with evidence of ancestral crimes, descendants of enslavers choose to defend the indefensible rather than acknowledge truth and consider reparative justice. The silence that protected these crimes during slavery protects them still through denial and minimization. Patricia's research opened other investigations. Historians began examining similar patterns in other counties, other states. Breeding networks weren't limited to Mississippi. They operated wherever slavery existed and reproduction was commodified. The scale was larger than anyone had documented before, hidden in archives that no one had thought to systematically cross-reference. The birth certificate that Patricia found wasn't unique. Other researchers began finding similar documents with similar notations, scattered across courthouse archives throughout the South. Each represented families destroyed, children commodified, women reduced to reproductive machinery. Each represented a silence that lasted over a century. Each represented a truth finally emerging. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Sarah and Thomas's story reach more people. In 2021, Patricia convinced 7 of her relatives to take DNA tests through multiple genetic genealogy platforms. The results confirmed what the birth certificate suggested: genetic connections to multiple white families who had owned plantations in Mississippi during the slavery era, including strong matches to Thornhill descendants. One match was particularly significant: a second cousin connection to Rebecca Thornhill Morrison, a 68-year-old woman living in Atlanta, whose family tree showed direct descent from Judge Marcus Thornhill through his eldest son, Marcus Jr. Patricia reached out through the DNA platform's messaging system. "My name is Patricia Freeman Johnson. Our DNA shows we're second cousins. My great-great-grandfather was Thomas, born enslaved in 1850. His birth certificate lists Judge Marcus Thornhill as his mother's previous owner. I believe we share a common ancestor through him." 2 weeks passed with no response. Then, "This is Rebecca. I received your message. This is difficult information. Can we speak by phone?" The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Rebecca had grown up with stories about Judge Thornhill as a distinguished jurist and family patriarch. Family legends emphasized his opposition to slavery, his civic contributions, his legal brilliance. The DNA results forced confrontation with a different truth. "My family never discussed this possibility," Rebecca said. "We have portraits of him in our home. My father named his law practice after him. This changes how we understand everything." Patricia sent the documented evidence, the birth certificate, the property records, Dr. Martinez's published research, the pattern of 17 documented women. Rebecca went silent again for several days. When she responded, her message was brief. "I've shared this with my siblings. We need time to process." Processing meant consulting family lawyers about whether acknowledging this history created legal liability. It meant arguing with siblings about whether to go public or maintain silence. It meant confronting the reality that family wealth, the investments, the property, the social capital that funded their educations and comfortable lives, originated in the systematic exploitation and forced reproduction of enslaved people. Most of Rebecca's siblings chose denial. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, that DNA matches didn't prove rape or forced reproduction, that historical accusations against the dead were unfair. One brother sent Patricia an angry email. "You're trying to destroy our family's reputation for your own purposes. Judge Thornhill was a good man. Stop spreading lies." But Rebecca made a different choice. In March 2022, she published an open letter in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "I am a direct descendant of Judge Marcus Thornhill of Mississippi. Recent genealogical research has revealed that my ancestor was involved in a forced breeding network that commodified enslaved women and children. DNA evidence connects my family to descendants of Thomas Freeman, born enslaved in 1850. I acknowledge this history. I acknowledge that my family's wealth and position derive in part from crimes against humanity. I commit to supporting truth-telling about slavery and reparative justice efforts." The letter created a family rupture. 3 of Rebecca's 4 siblings stopped speaking to her. Cousins accused her of betraying family memory. Her father, then 92 years old, reportedly refused to see her, but her public acknowledgement also created space for other conversations. Other white descendants of slaveholders began reaching out to Patricia and Rebecca. Some wanted to acknowledge family history. Some wanted to establish relationships with black descendants. Some wanted to discuss reparations, whether descendants of enslavers had moral obligations to descendants of enslaved people. These conversations were painful and complex. What does reparation look like 160 years after emancipation? Money, land, public acknowledgement, education funding. There were no simple answers, but the conversations themselves represented progress, replacing silence with dialogue, denial with acknowledgement. Patricia and Rebecca met in person in June 2022 in Memphis, roughly halfway between Detroit and Atlanta. They stood together at the National Civil Rights Museum, built at the site of Dr. King's assassination. They discussed family history, genetic connections, and what justice might mean generations after crimes were committed. "I can't undo what my ancestor did," Rebecca said, "but I can refuse to defend it. I can acknowledge truth. I can support efforts toward repair." They discussed establishing a scholarship fund for descendants of enslaved people from the Oakmont area. They discussed supporting historical preservation efforts. They discussed genetic genealogy projects that could help other families reconstruct histories that slavery had destroyed. The DNA testing also revealed other uncomfortable truths. Genetic evidence showed that Judge Thornhill was likely Thomas's biological father, meaning Sarah had been forcibly impregnated by Thornhill, then sold to Whitmore while pregnant to obscure paternity. This wasn't speculation. The genetic markers were clear. Thomas's Y chromosome DNA matched Thornhill's male line descendants. This explained the birth certificate notation. The clerk who wrote previous ownership documented per maternal records may have understood what was happening, that Thornhill was disposing of a woman he'd impregnated to avoid acknowledgement while ensuring his business partner would own the child. The transaction served both profit and propriety, hiding sexual violence behind commercial transaction. 15 of the 17 women identified in Dr. Martinez's research showed similar patterns in genetic analysis where descendants could be located for testing. The breeding network wasn't just about forced reproduction generally. It often involved the enslavers themselves as fathers, then selling pregnant women to hide paternity while retaining commercial relationships with the buyers. This was rape weaponized as economic strategy, women reduced to reproductive vessels, children treated as crops, family connections deliberately severed, and all of it legal, profitable, and defended by courts and churches in communities that chose profit over humanity. The genetic evidence made denial impossible. DNA doesn't lie about biological relationships. The patterns were too consistent to explain as coincidence. White descendants who had maintained family mythologies about good men who happened to own slaves but treated them well had to confront evidence that their ancestors had systematically raped enslaved women, sold them while pregnant to business partners, and profited from selling their own children. Some white descendants responded by disappearing from genetic genealogy platforms, making their profiles private, refusing to engage with evidence. Others, like Rebecca, chose acknowledgement and attempted repair. The divide largely correlated with political ideology. White descendants who already believed in systemic racism and reparations could more easily acknowledge ancestral crimes than those who defended current racial hierarchies by defending historical ones. By 2023, Patricia and Rebecca had located 47 living descendants of the 17 documented women in the breeding network. Most were scattered across the country: Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. The Great Migration had dispersed families that slavery and Jim Crow had shattered. Genetic genealogy and historical research were beginning to reconstruct connections that had been deliberately destroyed. They organized a reunion in August 2023 in Mississippi, near the former Oakmont site. 73 people attended, descendants of enslaved people and a handful of white descendants of enslavers willing to acknowledge truth. They shared stories. They shared DNA results. They shared documents that had taken decades to locate. They mourned together the losses that could never be recovered, the names that were erased, the families that were shattered, the childhoods that were stolen. This wasn't reconciliation. Reconciliation implies equal harm that needs to be mutually forgiven. This was acknowledgement. White descendants finally acknowledging what their ancestors did. Black descendants finally having their family histories validated by documentary and genetic evidence after generations of being told those histories didn't matter or couldn't be proven. The reunion included a ceremony at the memorial site. Participants spoke names: Sarah, Thomas, the 17 documented women whose names had been preserved in fragmentary records, the children who had been bought and sold. the descendants who had carried questions for generations without answers. Rebecca spoke. I stand here as a descendant of Judge Marcus Thornhill, acknowledging that my ancestor committed crimes against humanity. I acknowledge that my family benefited from those crimes for generations. I commit to truth-telling and supporting reparative justice however I can. Patricia spoke. I stand here as a descendant of Sarah and Thomas Freeman, acknowledging that their pain lives in me, but so does their resilience. We survived. We're here. Our histories were hidden, but not destroyed. We remember. The silence that had protected these crimes for 173 years was finally breaking. The documentary and genetic evidence created momentum for legal action. In September 2023, a coalition of descendants filed a lawsuit in federal court. Freeman et al. v. Thornhill Estate et al. The case sought recognition of historical crimes and compensation for descendants of enslaved people from the estates and corporate successors of enslavers. Legal experts predicted failure. Precedent was terrible. Every previous lawsuit seeking reparations for slavery had been dismissed on various grounds: statute of limitations, sovereign immunity, lack of standing, difficulty establishing damages. Courts had consistently ruled that descendants of enslaved people couldn't recover for harms their ancestors suffered, and that descendants of enslavers couldn't be held liable for their ancestors' actions. But this case had something previous cases lacked: specific documented evidence of specific crimes against specific people, combined with genetic proof of relationships and financial records showing how wealth was transferred across generations. It wasn't a broad claim about slavery generally. It was documented evidence about this network, these people, these transactions. The lawsuit detailed the 17 documented cases, the financial records showing payments, the birth certificates and property documents, and the genetic evidence proving biological relationships. It sought 3 forms of relief: official recognition and acknowledgement from state and federal government of the crimes committed, compensation calculated based on the value of labor stolen, adjusted for inflation, establishment of an education fund for descendants. The estimated monetary value exceeded $15 million based on economic analyses of cotton production value, land appreciation, and compound interest over 173 years. Defendants included the Thornhill Family Trust, which still controlled some assets from Judge Thornhill's estate, Whitmore Agricultural Corporation, corporate successor to the plantation, the state of Mississippi, for its role enforcing and legitimizing slavery, and the federal government, same reason. All defendants moved to dismiss. Their arguments were predictable. Statute of limitations. Claims were filed over 150 years after the alleged harm's lack of standing. Plaintiffs suffered no direct harm. Only their ancestors did sovereign immunity. States and federal government can't be sued for historical governmental actions. No legal duty. Even if crimes occurred, defendants have no legal obligation to descendant plaintiffs. Impossibility of calculation. Damages can't be accurately calculated. 173 years later. The motion to dismiss hearing occurred in March 2024. Patricia attended along with 23 other descendants. The courtroom was full. Media, legal scholars, civil rights organizations, and white families connected to the defendants who opposed the lawsuit. Judge Sarah Washington, an African-American woman appointed by President Biden, heard arguments. The defense attorneys emphasized precedent. No court had ever allowed reparations claims to proceed past motion to dismiss. They argued that however tragic slavery was, the legal system couldn't remediate harms that occurred generations ago. If this court allows these claims, argued the Thornhill Family Trust attorney, every family in America with ancestors who owned slaves could be sued. This would create chaos and punish people for actions they didn't commit. Patricia's attorney, Marcus Chen, countered, "This case isn't about general slavery reparations. It's about specific documented crimes by specific individuals whose estates still exist and still benefit from those crimes. My clients aren't asking descendants to be punished. They're asking estates built on crime to return what was stolen." Judge Washington took the motion under advisement. 4 months later, in July 2024, she issued a stunning 53-page ruling that partially denied the motion to dismiss. The ruling acknowledged that most reparations claims failed for the reasons defendants cited. But this case was different because plaintiffs could document 1. Specific crimes by specific individuals, 2. Specific traceable harms to specific people, 3. specific estates that still existed and still contained assets derived from those crimes, and 4. Genetic and documentary evidence establishing standing. Judge Washington dismissed claims against state and federal government based on sovereign immunity. She dismissed claims seeking damages for emotional distress or generalized harms of slavery, but she allowed to proceed claims for unjust enrichment against the private estates, based on documented evidence that those estates still contained assets traceable to the forced labor and reproduction of plaintiffs' ancestors. Justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, Judge Washington wrote. While most claims about historical harms cannot proceed due to practical and legal barriers, claims with specific documentation of specific crimes and specific traceable benefits present justiciable questions. Whether the statute of limitations bars recovery will be determined after discovery. The ruling made national news. It was the first time a federal court had allowed slavery reparations claims to proceed to discovery. Conservative legal commentators predicted it would be overturned on appeal. Progressive commentators called it a breakthrough that recognized how wealth transfers across generations, even when crimes are committed generations ago. The Thornhill Family Trust immediately appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The case stalled there for months while briefing was completed. Meanwhile, discovery began for the claims that weren't on appeal. Plaintiffs' attorneys obtained access to Thornhill Estate financial records, Whitmore Corporation historical documents, and various other archives. What discovery revealed exceeded expectations. Whitmore Corporation's predecessor company had maintained detailed ledgers documenting the forced labor and reproduction of enslaved people from 1840 through 1865. These ledgers calculated breeding efficiency, projected future inventory based on pregnant women, and assigned monetary values to children before birth. The documents were horrifying. Human beings reduced to livestock accounting. Financial records showed how wealth generated from slavery had been continuously reinvested across generations. The $850 paid for Sarah in 1850, equivalent to approximately $30,000 in 2024 dollars, generated labor value and offspring value that compounded over decades. Land purchased with slavery profits appreciated. Investments made with slavery wealth grew. By 2024, the traceable assets exceeded $8 million. The discovery also revealed something unexpected. Judge Thornhill had kept a private journal that his descendants preserved but never made public. The journal, maintained from 1845 until his death in 1872, contained explicit references to his business arrangement with Whitmore and others in acquiring and impregnating enslaved women, then selling them to partners to avoid public scrutiny while sharing profits.